This is the White Coat Investor Podcast, where we help those who wear the white coat get a fair shake on Wall Street. We've been helping doctors and other high-income professionals stop doing dumb things with their money since 2011.
This is White Coat Investor Podcast number 417. Get rich fast as a millionaire with Roth conversions. Brought to you by Laurel Road for Doctors. Laurel Road is committed to serving the unique financial needs of residents and doctors. We want to help make your money work harder and smarter. If credit card debt is weighing you down and you're struggling with monthly payments, a personal loan designed for residents with special repayment terms during training could help you consolidate your debt. Check if you qualify for a lower rate. Plus, White Coat investors also get an additional rate discount when they apply through laurelroad.com/WCI. For terms and conditions, please visit www.laurelroad.com/WCI. That's www.laurelroad.com/WCI. Laurel Road is a brand of KeyBank NA member FDIC. All right, how do you like that clickbaity title? I'm being told that if we title these podcasts differently, a different number of people listen to them. So the key is apparently to put get rich, millionaire, and something about Roth in the title. And then you all listen to the podcast. I can't explain this, but this is the way it works. And so we're going to talk about some of that stuff today. So I figured it was fair enough to put it all into the title. And now you know how the online, financial, whatever business we're in, functions. Thanks everybody out there for what you're doing. I know you're not all online infopreneurs like we are. You're actually doing important work where it makes a difference in people's lives. And I thank you for that. Sometimes we don't acknowledge as much as we should just how difficult your jobs are. And I appreciate you doing that. By the way, we have got a promotion going right now on our online courses. Okay, this podcast drops May 1st, I'm told. This promotion goes through May 9th. So you got about 9 days if you listen to this the day it drops. If you go to whitecoatinvestor.com/courses, you'll see that we have 20% off everything. Okay, that's all of our online courses. That makes our new Fire Your Financial Advisor student course just $79, right? I mean, people have asked for years, we need cheaper courses. Well, here's as cheap as we can make a course and have this thing. I don't even know if it pencils out. We're probably, losing money on this course, but it's designed for students. It's Fire Your Financial Advisor, designed for students. You can upgrade to the resident version. You get credit for what you paid for the student version. You can upgrade to the attending version later. You can even upgrade to the CME version. That CME version is called Financial Wellness and Burnout Prevention for Medical Professionals. It's our full attending version, Fire Your Financial Advisor, plus 8 hours of wellness content. It's great content, even by itself, but it makes the entire thing qualify for CME. So you can use your CME funds to buy that. Well, it's 20% off through May 9th. The return on investment of these courses, if you don't know the stuff we're teaching in this, and you could spend a lot of hours trying to learn it yourself, reading blog posts and listening to podcasts and reading books, or we will spoon feed it to you in these courses, having taken all the high yield stuff, put it all together in one place, and given it to you all at once. There's serious return on investment for these courses, whether it's our no hype real estate investing course, whether it is our Fire Your Financial Advisor course, whether it's our continuing financial education 25 course, the one we make from the conference each year. You don't have to learn much from these to more than pay for the price of the course, especially when we're giving it to you 20% off. So check that out, whitecoatinvestor.com/courses. It's 20% off through May 9th. Use the code podcast20 at checkout. I got an email from one of the people we work with for insurance. We have these agents that we have worked with for a long time that help a lot of investors, a lot of white coat investors to get their term life and disability insurance in place. These are the experts in the industry. They sell together more policies than anybody else in the industry, right? They know these things inside and out. And we work with them to make sure they're serving you guys as best they can, that they're not hawking you a bunch of whole life policies or anything you don't need. But every now and then I get some feedback from them. One of them sent me an email recently, said he helped implement a disability insurance policy for a resident that had resisted at first to go through with the application, but ultimately agreed getting a policy would be in the doc's best interest. Wednesday, the doc called this person back. This is about 3 months after getting disability insurance. This is a resident, I think, early 30s, and to say he's going in for surgery on Friday. Turned out he had been diagnosed with cancer, and was hoping it would all resolve itself within 6 months, but that he was going to have to make a disability insurance claim. The point of the email as being sent was that nobody thinks this is going to happen to them, right? Nobody thinks they can get disabled. We all think we're Superman. But look around. You're taking care of lots of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s that get disabled. Whether it's from a cancer diagnosis or whether it's falling off the Grand Teton, it does happen. And imagine how grateful you would be to have that disability insurance in place, especially early in your career, before you have any sort of a significant nest egg, especially if you've got to live off it long term. Now, hopefully this doc's only living off it for a few months while doing surgery and chemotherapy, et cetera. But, it could become a long-term disability. And, it's good to get that coverage in place when you're young and healthy and it's cheap and you can still get it. Because once you have a diagnosis like this, it's much, much harder to get disability insurance in place. So the agent wrote to me, I'm so passionate about what I do every day, and this just makes it so evident that our work together is so valuable. As always, I'm really grateful for our partnership, which allows me to help as many physicians as possible. Get your disability insurance in place. Okay, we've got Chris Davin here today. This is a Friends of WCI episode, which I love doing because I get somebody else to bat around with and to argue with and to help answer your questions with. Chris Davin, I'll introduce him a little more in just a second when I get him on the call. But Chris was a speaker at WCI Con 25 as well as a previous one. If you want to be a speaker at WCI Con, first of all, let me tell you, you don't have to know as much as Chris to be a speaker. Chris really knows his stuff, as you're going to realize as we get into this podcast. But we're calling for speakers now. This is for WCI Con 26. It's in Las Vegas at the end of March, right? Mid-March next year. Okay, we're taking applications from now until June 15th. You apply at WCIevents.com. If you really want to speak, here's the secret. Put in for more than one talk. Okay, if it's only one talk and we already got somebody giving that talk, or we don't want that talk, or we think somebody would give the talk better than you, we're not picking you, right? But if you give us choices, 2, 3, 4 different talks, you have a better chance of being selected as a speaker. It is a competitive process. About 80% of applicants don't get selected. And I'm sorry about that. I wish I could have all of you come speak at WCI Con, but it's just there's limited space, there's limited time. And we want to change it up a little bit every year, but we also want to get the really top-notch, best-rated people back from time to time as well. But please do apply, and we'll take a very serious look at your application. I had somebody that I had on the podcast not long ago that's like, I've applied 5 years in a row and still haven't been selected. And it's true. Sometimes you don't get selected for a while, but we hope to get you there eventually, especially if you're a great speaker with a great topic that we want to get out to white coat investors at WCICon. Okay, let's get Chris on the line. This is a long episode already, but I think we go into so much good stuff, you're going to love it. I apologize in advance if we spend too much time on this episode out in the weeds, but I think we spend enough time on basic stuff too that'll be beneficial to everybody. All right, this is another one of our Friends of White Coat Investor episodes. And so we've got somebody here to help me to explain things to you, to help me answer your questions. We have Chris Davin. Chris, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
For those who don't know Chris has been a WCI Con speaker a couple of times. He's been on the podcast before. What number was that one, Megan? 359, I think it was. About a year ago. Talked about, got into all kinds of fun stuff in the weeds, talked about Roth versus traditional contributions. We'll reference a little bit of that stuff today. But what you need to know about Chris is that Chris is not a doc. He's married to a doc, yes, but he's not a doc. He is an engineer, which comes with its entirely different set of strengths and weaknesses, right? I mean, docs, we probably deserve our terrible reputation as do-it-yourself investors, right? That's probably not the case for engineers, right? And the reason why is investing is actually an engineering problem, right? That's what it is. You're trying to optimize it to be good enough, not perfect necessarily, but good enough. And so the engineering mindset lends itself really well, I think, not only to just being a competent investor, but in particular, being a competent do-it-yourself investor. Engineers are almost always very comfortable with spreadsheets. And frankly, if you're not comfortable with spreadsheets, maybe you shouldn't be managing your own money, at least the very basics of a spreadsheet. I'm not talking about designing some fancy high-powered one. I'm just talking about, a little bit of, financial calculations in the spreadsheets, basic multiplication and addition, and keeping columns straight and those sorts of things. I think it's pretty important to portfolio management. So, Chris, what do you see as the weaknesses of being an engineer when it comes to personal finance and investing?
Oh, geez. You're really putting me on the spot. Yeah, so I think sometimes I think you can make better the enemy of good enough. I think that is possible. I will say in engineering, when we're solving engineering problems, that's a tendency that we have to fight as well, right? Like, I see that all the time. People are building hardware and they want to keep testing it and testing it. Not everybody. I think typically like younger engineers have that. I think as you get older, you tend to over time learn when the times you really need to kind of test the heck out of something and when it's okay to just kind of let it go out the door. But I think that's certainly a risk. Yeah, I think maybe something else I would say is kind of along the same lines is like kind of getting hung up on doing things that may not have the biggest impact overall on the portfolio. For instance, like if it's like rebalancing on a really strict schedule, maybe that would be an example. Or, maybe, having too many asset classes in your portfolio, having a small value and having a small growth and, having a Europe international, have an Asia international, have an emerging markets and, have 2.5%, of this class and 5% of the class. Like it can kind of get a little bit too complicated. I think that, there is, I think in general for everybody too, not just engineers, there is this tendency to kind of tinker and make things more complex over time. It's like if you have 3 asset classes, then, you add a 4th and you add a 5th. And then once you've handled that, then you come back, in a month and you're like, well, geez, what do I want to do now? Well, I'm going to add a 6th one. So I think there is definitely that
and
tendency
all of a sudden
well.
you're up to 13 and
yeah.
Clearly you've made it overly complex. Yeah, for sure. That's what I'd say. I mean, engineers tend to like to get out into the weeds, tend to get into the details maybe a little too much. So fair warning for this episode. We're going into the weeds today. We'll try to pull it back every now and then. If this is your first White Coat Investor podcast episode you've ever listened to, recognize that not all of them go this deep into the weeds. And so I'll try to at least make you understand where we're at when we leave the pathway to go talk about, what's off in the weeds. And keep in mind that the basics remain the same, right? You need to save a reasonable amount of money, fund a reasonable plan, reasonably well, and you just stick with it in the long term. Those are the basics, right? But if all we ever talked about was the basics, don't carry, 30% credit card debt, there wouldn't be much to talk about on this podcast. So we're going to get a little bit out into the weeds today. Chris did an awesome presentation at our last WCI Con. This is available, by the way, in our Continuing Financial Education 25 class. That was spectacular. Right? Covered all the details you need to know about business taxes. If you've thought about being a sole proprietor or you're thinking about an S Corp, those sorts of issues. This presentation is excellent. Highly recommend it. In that presentation, you referenced a little bit a rule of thumb I've thrown out there from time to time, which is that if a doc doesn't have at least $100,000 in distributions as an S Corp, right? Money, your profit from your S Corp above and beyond what you're paying yourself as a salary, it's probably not worth the hassle of incorporating. And you thought maybe even that figure was a little bit too low, especially once you consider the 199A deduction. Share your thoughts with us about incorporating, why it gets so overblown, oversold, and maybe how people ought to be thinking about it.
Yeah, so I will throw some numbers at you in a minute, but as part of sort of my own decision making for my own financial life and for my family's, and then also in sort of preparing the talk, I did some research on incorporating, and if you go online, there's a lot of places where they really strongly recommend incorporating. Like, it's this great thing. There's a lot of kind of really vague, kind of hand wavy references to tax savings without really being too specific about what it is. I think, there's maybe kind of the implication that some of the income would be income tax free, which is not true. It's all the income from your corporation is ultimately taxable as income. The only potential tax savings is that any distributions that you take are payroll tax free, which probably for most doctors, if you're above the Social Security wage base, you're only talking about 2.9 or 3.8% savings. So, again, your $100,000 distribution, that's about maybe $3,800, which is not nothing. But there's a whole bunch of other costs that sort of outweigh that. And there's, I don't know, I found a lot of places where, people would say things like, oh, when you're incorporated, it just makes your business sound so official. You can be, so-and-so Inc. And, people respect that and they're going to do more business. It's like most doctors, like if you're an emergency doctor, nobody cares whether you're incorporated or not. People don't care about your tax structure at all. This is just really a non-issue. So you should pick the option that will save you most overall taxes, including the payroll taxes and a couple of other things I'm about to mention. And then there is value in simplicity. Not having to do a balance sheet, not having to deal with payroll. There's some real value in having things be kind of simpler. So certainly for some situations, if you're able to take $200,000-$300,000 of distributions, save 3.8% on all of that, and then there's no sort of offsetting downside, I'd say it's probably worth the extra complexity. But for a lot of doctors, I don't think it is. And then the other thing I'll say is, depending on the state that you're in and the rules, you may not have a choice. Like, I think in California, my spouse, she has to be incorporated as like a personal medical corporation, which is a type of S corporation. So she doesn't have a choice to be a sole proprietor. I would recommend to her that she would be a sole proprietor if that were an option, but it's not. So yeah, so there's this payroll tax savings on the distributions, which is a small benefit, but you got to weigh against that the extra cost of hiring an accountant to do a separate tax return, and the tax return is more complex. If you make over $250,000, I think you have to maintain a balance sheet, which is kind of an extra step, an extra time, which means extra money to get that right. I think my wife, back when she had a professional accountant here, again, it's Los Angeles, so maybe the prices are a little higher, but she was paying about $4,000 to have an accountant do bookkeeping and corporate taxes. And then that was not even the payroll cost. And a payroll service a year costs $500 or $1,000. So right there, your $3,800 of payroll tax savings is gone, and you're actually in the hole. The other thing I think a lot of people don't realize is that this 199A deduction, which is part of the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that is typically smaller for an S corporation. So if you're a sole proprietor, you get that deduction on your whole income. Whereas if you have an S corporation, you only get that deduction on the business profit. So, and that deduction is worth quite a bit. So if it's, let's be conservative and let's say somebody's in the 24% tax bracket, and then the deduction is 20%. So 20% and 24%, that's like 4.8%. We can maybe call that 5. So, let's say you have $300,000 of income, you've got $100,000 of distributions and $200,000 of wages. You're gaining the payroll tax savings, which is, again, let's say $3,800 on the profit, but you're losing 4.8% on the $200,000 of wages that you're paying yourself, in addition to all those other downsides. So it's really, for a lot of people, it's not that good of a deal. Now, you can find cases where if people are phased out of that deduction, not getting the deduction anyway, then it kind of tips back the other way. So it can kind of go both ways. But I think one of the things that I wanted to challenge is this idea that, there's all this money that can be saved by incorporating, and it's this great thing. It's really more of kind of a specialized thing. There's, probably a relatively small percent, maybe, 20%, 30% of doctors would actually save money by incorporating. If I had to just make a wild guess, the majority, I would suspect, would probably be just better off as a sole proprietorship.
Yeah, it's probably even lower than that, given how many docs are employees. You're just talking 20 or 30% of the self-employed.
I'm talking self-employed, yeah.
Totally agree with that. And I think most people, if you are making enough money that an S Corp makes sense, you're probably making too much money as a doc to get the 199A deduction. You're probably phased out of it, would be my guess for most people. The other thing people get hung up on with these corporations is they think there's some big liability coverage there, that they're going to keep themselves from getting cleaned out in a malpractice suit. Don't forget, malpractice is always personal.
Yeah.
Forming a corporation does not help you reduce your malpractice risk at all. Maybe it reduces some unusual business risks, but let's be honest, if you're an independent contractor, it's just you. You don't have a lot of business risk. The only risk you've got is your malpractice risk, and that corporation isn't going to help with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It can get a little more complicated if you're talking about like a non-medical field, if somebody is starting some other general business making things. But I do think it's worth pointing out that I think it's true, at least in most states, maybe all, that you can create an LLC and that will provide you that liability protection. Again, it doesn't protect for medical malpractice, but if you're, selling some other product or, whatever you're doing or investing in real estate or whatever, and you want to have some extra liability protection, you can create an LLC, which will give you that protection. And LLCs, you have the option of being taxed as a sole proprietor or as an S corporation. Those are sort of two separate things. So you get to pick which one you want. The tax structure is independent from kind of the business structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with that. Okay. The last time we had you on the podcast a year ago or so, we talked about Roth contributions and Roth conversions. And you mentioned an email you sent to me recently that you wanted to add a few more factors to that discussion, maybe a little bit more nuance to it. So let's go through a little bit more on this topic. And granted, this is a topic that's out in the weeds, right? Because this is probably the most complicated thing in personal finance. When you consider all the factors that go into affecting your Roth versus pre-tax contributions, or whether you should do a Roth conversion, most of the time it's basically the same question. But people send me emails all the time with some trivial amount of detail about their financial life and go, which one should I do? They just don't realize how complicated this decision is. So walk us through very briefly kind of typical physician choices. Sometimes it is obvious what to do. Sometimes it requires a calculation or a lot of guesswork to figure out what to do. But walk us through kind of typical physician choices of maybe when to be thinking about doing Roth contributions.
Yeah, well, let me say, I think you're right that it is the most complex decision in personal finance. I mean, I can't think of anything more complicated just because it folds in so many inputs from your whole life. I mean, you're basically tax planning for your entire life, all the way through retirement and the end of your life, and then even estate planning if whatever money you leave to your heirs. So you're trying to make predictions about your tax situation over many decades, and then potentially your heirs who may not even be born yet, or maybe they're in diapers now. You don't know whether they're going to end up being, investment bankers or teachers. And then you also have to consider where you're staying, where you're living. State taxes are a factor, your investment performance, how can you predict and what kind of investments you're going to have and how they're going to perform over decades. So yeah, it is a very complex problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like it. But that also makes it, the most difficult problem that I can think of in personal finance. I think you're right about that. So, I was on a year ago and we went through for about an hour in a lot of detail, including a lot of math. And I was thinking about, after that, ways to try to maybe make it a little simpler, or maybe add a couple kind of rules of thumb that I think would be applicable to kind of a typical doc that doesn't necessarily fall into one of those categories where it's really obvious, like, oh, you're in the military, you're a military doc, you check all the boxes, you resident of a tax-free state, half your income is tax-free, you're getting a pension, therefore you do Roth, right? If you're kind of in the middle, what do you do? So the standard advice, which I think is right, is that if you're in a residency, or even if you're in medical school or whatever, if you have a second career and you have some money to convert, I think that Roth in those low income years is correct. I think that's right. You're basically, one of the ways to think about Roth is
although there is the caveat with that, with student loan management, right? If you're trying to get a bunch of student loans forgiven,
that is true.
Everything, there's an exception, right? I mean, there are so few clear-cut things with this issue, but for the most part, I totally agree with you. Low income years is Roth.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think that's about the only exception that I could think of is if you're playing games with student loans. But yeah, I mean, so Roth, I think one way to think about it that I think might be helpful is you're basically making a bet on having future income, right? Because if you're not going to have any future income, pre-tax is the right choice because you get to fill up those lower brackets in the future when you're withdrawing it. And if you're in medical school or you're in residency and you're reasonably confident that you're going to be a doctor at least for a while, I think it makes sense to take that bet and pay a little bit of extra tax now and hopefully get a bigger tax savings later. One of the things that I mentioned in last year was that, there is this kind of contributing the maximum effect where if you're up at your contribution limit, you're able to pack more money into your retirement accounts with Roth than with traditional. And that means that you have more money inside a retirement account where it's growing faster because it doesn't have tax drag versus leaving it outside of the account in a taxable account. And that over time can give a pretty substantial advantage to the Roth option, even if you have a relatively high tax rate now. So if you think about it, let's say you live in a high tax state, I live in California, and you have a high tax rate, that kind of cuts both ways because the money in the taxable account gets a bigger chunk taken out every year when you're paying that high rate and paying your state taxes on all those capital gains and dividends. So for higher income folks, the advantage for long stretches of time can actually tip back to Roth if you're contributing the maximum. So for an early career doc, it's like, well, what do? You've got this advantage where, if you pack your accounts with Roth in your 30s, you can potentially get this bigger advantage in your 60s and 70s. But the other offsetting advantage, though, of pre-tax, though, is especially if you don't have any pre-tax money, there's a big advantage for those first, few $100,000 of pre-tax savings because, if you have any low income years, those can be converted to Roth at a really low rate. Or, you probably know the statistics better than me, but, medicine is a hard field. If you're starting out as an orthopedic surgeon at 30, there's a decent chance you might not be able to work, 35 or 40 full years of that. That's a hard job. And leaning a little bit pre-tax earlier in your career to kind of protect against the possibility of maybe not having all of that income, all those millions of dollars you could calculate out, having that materialize for whatever reason, you're disabled or you burn out or, you just, get fed up with the field and go just decide to become a science teacher or something like that, right? Like there's a significant percentage of docs do that. So one of the big tensions in my mind is especially for early docs is, do you make this big bet on having this full career of, income and maybe getting a slight advantage by doing Roth, or do you go pre-tax to kind of protect yourself against the possibility of maybe not all of that income coming in? I think it makes sense to do pre-tax at least for the first, certainly 5 years, maybe 10 years. Another advantage of doing pre-tax kind of early in your career is that, that's when you have the biggest need for cash. And not only are you contributing to retirement accounts, you're probably paying off student loans, at least for a while, most likely. You're saving up for a house. You've got, probably young kids, maybe they're in daycare, that adds some expense. So by doing pre-tax early in your career, that tax savings, you can use that. Maybe you're not saving it in taxable. Maybe you're using it to do those other things like pay down student loans, which is, that's basically a tax-free return because student loan income interest is not tax deductible, right? So I think it makes sense to do pre-tax early in your career. I can't say necessarily how many years, whether it's 5 or 10 or 15, but that kind of checks those boxes for me anyway. I think that the balance favors sort of doing that. Even if the math says...
The other thing I love about it is the optionality, right?
Yeah.
Once it's in Roth, it's in Roth.
Yeah.
You put it in pre-tax, you got some flexibility, have some optionality. You can always do a conversion later.
Yeah.
It gives you those options. Yeah. Okay. But the other thing, those of you out there, don't email me saying, hey, student loan interest can be deductible. Chris is right. Most of the time for attending docs, it is not deductible. It might be deductible for you a little bit while you're a resident, but and if you don't have a high income, but for most doctors, most of you out there listening to this, your student loan interest is not deductible. That is correct.
Yeah. So, if you're, for early attending docs, I think, especially if your marginal tax rate, if it's in the 30s, if you're in one of the 30% brackets, or maybe in 24%, but you've got a 5% state tax rate, if you're able to save 30 cents on the dollar for every dollar you put into your pre-tax accounts, I think that's worth doing. And again, we can come up with exceptions. Oh, gee, somebody has an earlier career and they already have $500,000 of pre-tax money. Maybe that argument doesn't apply. But I think for the typical doc, I think getting a bunch of pre-tax savings, saving some sort of multiple six-figure amount in pre-tax, then when you're 40 or 45, then you run the numbers on the Roth, because the advantage of leaving it in Roth for like 25 years versus 35 years is not that big. You don't get a lot of extra benefit for that extra 10 years. So then maybe you're in your 40 or 45, you've got a house you can afford, you're stable in your career, you've paid off your student loans, you're more stable. then you're in a better position to make that decision. Do I want to make the bet of putting 30, 50, 70, $100,000 a year into a Roth account and prepaying all those taxes and making that bet on whether I want to have this, big multi-million dollar portfolio by the time I'm 70. I think that's probably the best time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. There are times, though, where Roth is surprisingly good. People don't expect it to be quite as good as it is in certain situations. Let's talk about a few of those.
Yeah. So, I gave an example. This was at last year's WCI talk. I ran through the numbers in kind of a lot of detail, and I took what I thought was a typical case where the numbers showed that Roth actually had an advantage that you might not see if you just looked at kind of the context. So the example I gave was a couple living in California, high tax state, basically the highest tax state in the country, planning to retire in a low tax state. No pension. They were in their 40s. They'd saved well in their pre-tax accounts. They had at age 45, they had $1.5 million. This is a dual income couple, so they had a pretty high limit. One of the spouses was an independent contractor. The other one was an employee. So they had about $1.5 million of pre-tax account by the time they were 45. And if you apply the rules of thumb, you'd say, oh, geez, this is obviously a case for pre-tax. No pension, very high tax state now, tax-free state in retirement, but when you start to go through the math of it, there were a bunch of factors that kind of added up that really shrunk that benefit. One of which was that the $1.5 million that they had already saved very diligently during the first, let's say, 15 years of their career, that will grow and that will fill up all of the lower brackets. So this couple, when the time they retired at like maybe 65, they were already going to be in the 24% bracket just from their pre-tax savings and their Social Security. And they were in the maybe the 30-some% bracket now. So that already kind of shrinks the benefit by eliminating all those lower brackets. Then you add in IRMA, which was 5%. I went through the details. I won't do it again here, but people can listen to the other podcast. For people who retire with, I think for married couples, it's between about $200,000 and $400,000 of taxable income, which is typical for a doc. Then you pay an extra 5% Medicare premium when you're retired. And then there's this contributing the maximum effect, which knocked another maybe 10% off of that. So you think you have this huge gap. This couple had, I think, a 44% marginal tax rate. But Roth was almost the best choice. I think maybe pre-tax had like a 3 or 4% advantage when you include all of these factors. Now, Roth was still a little bit behind, but then you add the possibilities. This is what I walked through in kind of the second part of that. I said, okay, well, this couple's married, right? If one of those spouses dies early, which statistically there's a decent chance of that, the surviving spouse has to take all that money and all those RMDs on a single bracket scale. That completely wipes out the benefit. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was scheduled to have tax rates go up and starting in 2026. We don't know, I think, what's going to happen with that. It may or may not happen, but that was going to wipe out that benefit. Or if this couple retired basically to any income taxing state, aside from, Florida, Texas, or Washington, maybe, I forget all of them, but, any state that taxes income, typically the rate is about 5% or more. So that 3 or 4% benefit for pre-tax would be wiped out if they decide either to stay in California or to live in any state that taxes the income. So I said, yeah, pre-tax is still the best. The benefit is small. But, if any of these contingencies materialize, that flips over to Roth being the better. So, you got to, the way that I like to do it is I try to make it somewhat simpler. I try to separate it and I say, okay, run an analysis for your baseline case, make the simplest assumptions you can. If you don't have a plan on which state you're going to retire, assume you'll retire in the state you're in, run those numbers and see where that gets you. And then go through and look at the cases where, you've got something that leans heavily in one direction, like the tax bracket. If you're married, you can't get better tax brackets. You can only get worse if one spouse dies. If your plan is you retire in a tax-free state, you can't retire to a negative tax state. So you can only go up. So look at those differences where, if something changes, it will push you in one direction. And if all of those are leaning in one direction, then you might want to lean that way. As I said, it's complicated, but this is the best way that I could think of to try to kind of simplify it and be a little bit more systematic about it.
Yeah. Sometimes people start getting fixated on ratios, percentages of money they want in Roth versus pre-tax. That doesn't matter so much, though. It's really about the dollars when you start, actually getting into the numbers and the calculations of trying to figure this out, doesn't it?
Yeah. We went through last year, we went through some common misconceptions, which I hope was helpful to people. It was certainly helpful to me when I was sort of learning it, to think about, like, this is what you're not supposed to do. This is the way you're not supposed to think about it. Yeah. And, you mentioned you get a lot of questions about what's the right percentage of, should I have 80% in pre-tax, 20% in Roth? And our answer, which I think is correct, is that there is no correct ratio. But I think, again, maybe I hope this might help some people understand the concept a little better. The better way to think about it is, what is your absolute number of dollars of pre-tax money that you carry into retirement? Because if you think about it, what really matters, as we went through this last year, is that the future tax rate matters. It's the percent that you pay. It's the rate that you pay in the future versus the rate that you pay or save now, depending on which retirement account that you choose. So the calculation for that is, like, it's the tax brackets, right? Which is based on absolute number of dollars. So-and-so dollars is, 22, 24, 32, 35, and so on. So it's not the percentage that you have that's pre-tax, it's the absolute number of dollars. So one of the kind of maybe simplest ways to think about it is, however pre-tax balance that you carry into retirement, take 4% of that. That's your taxable income. You can add in any guaranteed income you have, subtract the standard deduction, and then look that up on the tax bracket scale. And that will tell you what your future tax rate is. So for people that have, for instance, if they have a big pre-tax balance, like just because they've been big super savers, or if they had money from an earlier career or whatever, or if they had investments that did really well in their pre-tax accounts, and they're carrying this huge balance in, then that should be a sign that you should lean more toward Roth, or maybe do more Roth conversions. On the other hand, if you haven't been great about saving pre-tax, your investments haven't done really well or whatever, if you're carrying kind of a small dollar amount in, then you should probably lean more towards saving pre-tax. But the point is, like, that calculation of basically your future income versus the tax brackets, like, that's where the rubber meets the road, really. That's what generates your percent that you pay. And that's really what matters the most for trying to decide which one is best.
You've mentioned before the Social Security tax torpedo. Explain what you mean by that.
Okay, so yeah, this is maybe one of the more complex aspects of this. So there's a calculation of how much Social Security income that you have, which is taxable when you're retired. And the calculation is a little complex. There's multiple steps to it. The bottom line is that if for whatever reason you enter retirement with no other taxable income other than Social Security, Social Security is basically tax-free. I don't even know if you have to file a return or not, but you definitely don't pay any tax. As you start to add in other income, like, for instance, coming from a pre-tax account, or if you have part-time income, or yield from your investments, real estate income, et cetera, then not only do you pay tax on that income, but you also pay tax on a percent of each dollar of Social Security tax. So you get this range. If you're single or married, there's a range for both of them, where you pay a really high tax rate as the Social Security that you pay gets phased in. And that range is pretty significant. Hang on a second. Let me look it up, if you don't mind.
To be fair, this is a relatively less well-to-do retiree problem. All right. I mean, hopefully most white coat investors are wealthy enough, have enough taxable income in retirement that 85% of their Social Security income is going to be taxable no matter what. This problem is for those who have some amount of taxable income less than that during their retirement years.
So that's the maximum. That's right, is 85%. For most white coat investors, it's probably not going to be an issue, where you're just basically so far above this range that you're just going to pay the 85% no matter what, and then that spike, you can kind of think of it as sort of averaging out over a much wider range of income. I have run some cases, though, I think, for people who are higher income, where you can actually hit it, especially if you're single. It's easier to hit it if you're single than if you're married. So if you're single, just for context, if you have anywhere between about $30,000 or $50,000 of other income, if you're single, that's non-Social Security income, that puts you right in that spike. And then even if you're a little bit above that, if you're at 50, 60, 70, that's not really a great place to be tax-wise because you're still paying that big spiked rate on that big chunk of income for basically every year that you're in retirement. So let's say if you're a single doc and if you don't have a huge pre-tax account, let's say because you've been an employee your whole career and you've only contributed the $23,000, $23,500 per year. Maybe you didn't get a big match. If you're not bringing this huge pre-tax balance in, the range, that $30,000 to $50,000, if you take 4%, that's about $750K to $1.3 million. If you enter retirement with an income, with a pre-tax balance around that range, you're going to be in or around the spike. And a doc can hit that because it's not about your total income; it's about your pre-tax balance. And in that case, the right move is to do a bunch of Roth conversions, get that pre-tax balance down, and then you can kind of come in right under that spike. You're not paying that rate, and then most of your income in retirement is going to be coming out of your Roth account. And you can actually get a significant benefit by doing that. So I think this is just something to be aware of. Usually the right time to kind of check it is maybe 5 or 10 years before you retire. Look at your pre-tax balance and see if you're going to be hit by that. Some of the factors that are in that calculation are also not indexed for inflation. So depending on what kind of time length you're talking about over time, more and more of that income, that spike kind of gets bigger and bigger and gets a little bit lower and lower on the income. So, it may over time become less of a problem for high income docs, but we don't know. Maybe the factors will eventually be indexed for inflation, or that will be updated. So it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, for sure, and something that most people don't realize exists until they're caught in it, and they're like, "Why is my marginal tax rate 60%? This is bizarre." And it's because you're caught in one of those little areas in the tax code where you really do have a marginal tax rate that is that high.
Yeah.
All right.
Or if you're slightly above it too, that can actually be even more, I'll say, dangerous, because your marginal tax rate on each dollar might be pretty low, but what you don't realize is there's this big kind of spike below you where you would get a pretty significant advantage, just like thousands of dollars a year of extra income after taxes by converting a bunch and getting under that rate. And you might not see it if you're just a little bit above it.
Yeah, for sure. All right. What about an independent contractor? You've got some thoughts on how people ought to think about their pre-tax versus Roth contributions when they're an independent contractor?
So, when you're an independent contractor, there's an additional layer that goes on to this, which is that, you've got this interaction between employee contributions and employer contributions, which can be taxed at a different rate. So, I gave an example in my business taxes talk where, if you are affected by the 199A deduction and you contribute money as the employer, you are losing that deduction because you're reducing your business profit, and you basically only get 80% of the benefit of contributing pre-tax as you would if you did it, like, for instance, out of your paycheck. So, if you're in the 35% bracket and you contribute your $23,000 or $23,500 out of your your paycheck, you get to save the full 35% in taxes on that. But then if you contribute out of the business, which, let's say it's your 25% of your wages, your business contribution, you only save 27%. And you can get cases if your pre-tax versus Roth calculation is pretty close, if they're about equal in value, you can decide to do your business contributions basically as mega backdoor Roth instead of coming directly out of the business in order to avoid losing that benefit. Now, just because you get a little bit less of a benefit by doing that doesn't mean always you shouldn't do it, right? Like if our pre-tax is very clearly the best option for you, then even saving a little bit less might still be better than Roth, if you have basically very little pre-tax money. But as your pre-tax income starts to rise, and as the kind of balance between pre-tax and Roth starts to get more even, kind of the first thing that you would want to take out are those business employer contributions, and you can switch those to Roth first by doing mega backdoor Roth, and then you can still get pre-tax by doing it out of your paycheck.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's not just for independent contractors. I mean, Katie and I found this out for us in the White Coat Investor. We do mega backdoor Roth contributions because we basically lose 199A deduction. for any
Yeah.
pre-tax ones, employer ones we do. So we don't do them. We do our entire contribution. My entire 401k contribution for the White Coat Investor 401k is mega backdoor Roth. $70,000 this year, mega backdoor Roth, the whole thing, because of this reason.
Yeah.
So if the 199A deduction is affecting you, this is absolutely something to pay attention to. All right, Chris, we have a decent disagreement on this topic. And I think it would benefit the audience for us to explore more about our disagreement.
Yeah, sure.
You're a big fan of doing a calculation to determine whether and how large of a Roth conversion to make, or whether to do Roth or tax deferred contributions. In fact, you put together a calculator. We'll link to this in the show notes. You should all check it out. He's got this cool calculator he's put together. It's a spreadsheet, as you might not be surprised, but it's pretty handy. But my problem is I'm not sure the calculation is even worth doing a lot of the time, because the calculation is so hard. Anybody that's been listening to this, their head's swimming, right? Because there's so many factors going into this, and the factors are not all equal. I mean, the most important thing, the first question you got to ask yourself about this question is, who's going to be spending this money, right? And what tax bracket are they likely to be pulling it out of the account in? And a lot of the calculators assume it's you spending the money. But that's not always the case. In fact, it's often not the case for all the dollars. I mean, if people are only taking out about 4% of their portfolio a year, on average, they're leaving a portfolio behind to heirs that is 2.7 times what they retired with. Somebody else is spending most of that money. Somebody else is paying the taxes at a different tax bracket. If you're leaving it to charity, right? Doing Roth contributions is stupid. You're paying taxes on money that would never be taxed. And so I think a lot of times people don't know who's going to be spending the money, much less what bracket they're going to be in, whether it's their spouse in a lower bracket or a higher bracket, themselves in a lower bracket or a higher bracket, their heirs in a lower bracket or a higher bracket, charity. And without knowing that, I'm not sure the rest even matters all that much. I mean, clearly there's cases where it's obvious to do one or the other. The other times, I'm not sure it matters. I don't think you can get it right even doing that calculation. But I want people to hear you make the case for doing the calculation with the best assumptions you can come up with.
Yeah, so I would probably separate it also into, sort of older folks who are either about to be retired or are already in retirement, and then sort of younger career folks. I think you can make a pretty strong case that if you're older, if you're within 5 years of retirement, or you're in retirement, you're doing Roth conversions every year, let's say you're even trying to kind of come in under one of those IRMA tax spikes, that using some software, for instance, converting up to the top of your current bracket, so you're getting a little bit of extra Roth money at a relatively low rate, doing that sort of shorter range planning, I think you can make a really strong case that you should be using some sort of software for that. And in fact, I'd even go further, and I'd say that if you have like basically 7-figure retirement accounts, and you're not comfortable doing that on your own, I think you could get benefit by hiring a per hour financial planner, a good one, like the ones that are on your website, a CFP or a CFA, to help you with that, because I do think that there is some real benefit by doing that. Now, again, we still don't know, for instance, what tax rates are going to do. There's still some uncertainty in it. But my opinion for that kind of shorter range planning, if you're over 60 with, a few $1 million of IRAs, I think it's worth it to really put some time into doing some planning for that. Where in my mind, it gets maybe a little more controversial, and this is probably where we have more disagreement, would be for younger folks, right? If you're 35, 40, 45, and, let's say you have a couple of young kids, you don't know what their tax situation is going to be like. You're a good saver, but, you have no idea whether state they're going to be living in, what their income is going to be, what their tax rate is going to be. Maybe you don't know how much you're going to be leaving to charity. Do you just take a guess? Do you do a 50-50? Do you use one of the rules of thumb, or do you sit down and spend, a few hours going through the numbers and trying to do this sort of long range tax planning? I like the number approach, and that's what I did for me. Is I sat down and actually, not only did I use the tool, I built the tool, right? And I'm happy to share that with your listeners who want to go give it a try.
Again, the link's in the show notes, so check out the tool he built. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So, I think there's some factors for me that make me lean more in that direction. One of which is, of course, I'm an engineer, so I'm comfortable with numbers and spreadsheets. That's sort of what I do every day. The second thing is that, being a little more systematic about it, you can catch things that you maybe miss if you're not using, if you're not using a tool and you're just kind of using rules of thumb, right? Like the example I gave earlier with IRMA, 5%, those can kind of add up to give you sort of some surprising results. And then, you know, I like the idea of sort of um, going through the exercise, getting an answer, and then sort of doing that, and not necessarily having confidence that it's the right thing, but more sort of doing it as the process. And maybe an example I would give, like I talked about rebalancing earlier. Some people will say, well, I rebalance once a year, or I'll rebalance when my bonds, go plus or minus 5% from whatever that threshold is. And they track in a spreadsheet, and when their bonds are, 25 or 15%, then they rebalance. I don't think it's a mistake to do it that way unless you're thinking that you're necessarily optimizing and getting the best answer. I think there is some value in having a process and kind of doing the process, taking the information you have, getting an answer, and doing it every year that way. Not necessarily convincing yourself that you've been able to accurately predict the future, but just that it gives you a way to kind of get at that number. And I like the idea of kind of having that and feeling like I've folded in the best information that I have right now, and that I've made not necessarily the correct decision, but the best decision that I can do. Like that's I think has a lot of appeal for me.
Yeah. One of my partners has taken a different approach. He's like, I have no idea. And he is literally his entire career split his contributions between Roth and tax deferred. He's like, I'm going to be wrong with half of it.
Yeah.
I don't know which half, but that's basically the approach he's taken his entire career. And the longer I go, the longer I do this, the longer I think about this question, the more wisdom I think there might be in that approach.
Yeah, there is. I mean, some of it comes down to, what do you want to spend your time doing, right? I have obviously taken this on as a hobby. I've spent, a lot of hours. And if you add up all the nights and weekends, that I've spent learning about this over, at least 10 years by this point, it's a lot. It's a lot of time. I could have done, if I decided, forget it, I'm just going to do 50-50 and I'm not going to worry about this. I could, we got climbing mountains or whatever with that time. But
not necessarily recommended on this podcast, by the way.
Yeah. I saw the video of your accident and the 911 call. It was terrifying. I'm very glad
for sure.
I'm very glad you recovered as well as you did from that.
Yeah.
I get a kind of a kick out of it, and I think that there were some other things too. Like for instance, my wife and I live in California. It's very expensive. Our budget is actually pretty tight, even despite having a decent income, just because of housing costs and childcare costs and things. So, that kind of motivates me, I think, to lean a little bit more in the kind of optimized direction. And, I get a lot of satisfaction out of it. But, I'm not sitting here thinking, at my age that I have been able to, definitely deduce what the best option is in the future. I think that would be a mistake, I think, to think that, you've been able to correctly predict what tax rates are going to be. And that, when I make my traditional Roth choices this year, that I've definitely figured out what the right one is. I think it's more of like, hey, I've folded in all of the things that I can think about that could potentially impact this. I've put all of that knowledge and I've made the best predictions that I can, and this is the result that I have. And then, every couple of years or whenever we have a major change in our financial life, I'll go back and reevaluate those. And that's the method that works for me.
Yeah. I wanted to share something with the audience that you taught me in our email interchanges in preparation for this podcast, something I didn't know previously, which is good, right? I've been doing this for a long time. I don't learn a lot of new stuff every year. Let's be honest. Sometimes I forget stuff and I relearn it, but this was something I'm pretty sure I never knew before that I just learned a couple of weeks ago from you. And that is under the SEP program, right? This is the substantially equal periodic payments, basically the early retirement exception for getting to your retirement account money before age 59 and a half. Under this program, you don't pay the penalty. You don't pay that 10% penalty for getting your retirement money out. But what I learned is that you do have to pay taxes, not just on the tax deferred money that you pull out, But on the Roth earnings, you pull out before age 59 and a half. Those don't come out tax-free. The Roth principal comes out first and comes out tax-free. But once you get into the earnings before age 59 and a half, those earnings aren't tax-free. And I think it's important that people realize that if they're planning on that being a major part of their pre-age 59 and a half funding. I don't think that's a big part of people's planning. Hopefully, most people are usually leaving the Roth money for a little bit later and using 457 money and taxable money and that sort of a thing. But it's one reason to be careful not to get into your Roth earnings before age 59 and a half for sure.
Yeah, I think just in the spirit of, again, trying to take this super complex problem and make it simpler, I think if you look at the early retirement scenario, really all of the factors line up that pre-tax is the right choice for that. Both that, you're able to get money out of those accounts more efficiently. Of course, pre-tax account, you do have to pay taxes on it coming out, but you didn't pay tax going in. Whereas Roth, you pay tax going in and then you pay tax on the growth coming out, even if you use a SEP. And then, the other big factor is that the earlier you retire, the bigger the spread between, your income when you're working and your income when you're retired, just because you've got less opportunity for growth and savings. So, the earlier you retire, the more pre-tax is the right thing to do. So, if you're planning on retiring, I would say earlier than like age 55, where you're really going to need that, early access to your money, pre-tax is the right way to go. And that's maybe a way to make it simple.
Plus, it gives you a lot more years before Social Security to do Roth conversions. That optionality we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
All right. I think we have beaten that horse to death between the two podcasts we've done about it. Let's do our quote of the day today. This one comes from Jim Quick, who said, "Knowledge is power." You hear it all the time, but knowledge is not power. It's only potential power. It only becomes power when we apply it and use it. Somebody who reads a book and doesn't apply it, they're at no advantage over someone who's illiterate. None of it works unless you work. We have to do our part. If knowing is half the battle, action is the second half of the battle. Love that quote. All right, let's take a question from a listener. This one's from Suzanne, who's got a question about mega backdoor Roths.
Hi, Dr. Dahle. Thank you so much for your podcast. It's incredibly helpful and one of the few places I found clear and accurate info on more advanced retirement planning topics. It's been a huge help on my FI journey. Quick question. My husband has a solo 401k for some self-employment income. He maxes out his employee deferral at his W-2 job, and in the past, he's used the solo 401k for employer contributions and a mega backdoor Roth. He just switched to W-2 employers, and his new workplace plan allows a mega backdoor Roth. If he maxes out up to the $70K limit at his W-2 job between employee, employer, and after-tax contributions, can he still do a mega backdoor Roth in his solo 401k? I know the $23,500 employee deferral is per person, but is the $70K overall limit per person or per plan? I've seen conflicting info out there and would love it if you could clarify it for me once and for all. Thanks so much.
Well, this is so refreshing, Chris. I mean, we've been arguing about something for the last 45 minutes that doesn't necessarily have a correct answer. This question actually does. And so that's reassuring. I mean, yes, you only get one employee contribution, your $23,500 this year, if you're under 50. That's all you get, no matter how many 401ks you have access to. But the other limit, the total contribution limit, that $70,000 limit, you get for every plan you have access to that belongs to an unrelated employer. And there's, that can be filled up with employer contributions, employee contributions, or after tax employee contributions, the one you used for the mega backdoor Roth IRA process. So yes, you absolutely can do it in two 401ks if both 401ks allow it, which is usually the issue. I've got two 401ks. One of them doesn't allow mega backdoor Roth contributions, so I can't do them, unfortunately. You have anything else to add on that one, Chris?
Yeah, it might just be worth mentioning the unrelated condition. So the reason that works in this case is because you think about the two employers. One is, let's just say, the hospital where this doc is working. The other one is the doc himself because he's self-employed. So because those are different entities, then you get separate limits. Where you run into trouble, like for instance, let's say this doc had two separate businesses that they both own. Even if the businesses are unrelated in the sense that they're in completely different fields, because they're both owned by the same person, you only get one $70,000 limit for both. So if this doc has, one LLC for making, his fishing lures, and then the other one for doing, moonlighting in an urgent care clinic, different fields, but because they're both owned by him, you only get one limit. That also applies to spouses. If you're married, for instance, you and your spouse are not allowed to have, separate businesses and then hire each other so that you can get a $70,000 limit in both plans for both spouses. The rules are called the controlled group rules. They're actually really complicated because they're all these familial relationships. But to make it simple, if you're owned by the businesses, if a group of businesses are owned by either you or people that are closely related to you, then the limit applies, to the totality of those businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Unrelated employers. It is important. The terminology and understanding what the terms mean matter. But when we were preparing for this, you mentioned that I haven't talked about PTET on the podcast in years. And I actually felt kind of bad about this because this is a really important deduction to me.
Yeah.
And lots of people should be using this deduction. So would you mind reminding people what the PTET deduction is and who it applies to?
Yeah. So it's called the PTET. The acronym stands for Pass-Through Entity Tax, a PTET. So I think if you understand the background of this, the logic should make sense. So starting in 2018, the IRS at the federal level limited the amount that a taxpayer is allowed to deduct for what's called state and local taxes. Sometimes that's abbreviated SALT. So this is on your Schedule A. This is like your itemized deductions. Typically, that would be any local taxes, like usually that's like property tax if you're a homeowner, and then state taxes, which if you live in an income taxing state, and most do, then your state taxes. Those are all limited to $10,000, and that limit does not double if you're married. If you're married, you still only get $10,000. So for a lot of people, especially if you're a homeowner, or if you're a doc that lives in a high income tax state, that deduction gets capped at that $10,000, which is not good. So I think most states at this point, I don't know if there are any that don't, if they have an income tax, they have an option where if you are a business owner, you can pay some of your personal income tax liability through the business, and then it becomes a deductible business expense. When I say deductible, that's at the federal level, right? Because when you file your federal business taxes, that's listed as a deductible tax that you pay out of the business, and then that's a deduction at the federal level. So that's the idea, which is these states have a way to, it doesn't really benefit them in any way, but it does benefit the business owners in those states, is that they're able to reduce their federal liability and get it back to where it was hopefully close to be fully deductible. Like I live in California, and I know the calculation for California. I don't really know it that well for other states. I'm not an accountant, of course. But if you live in an income taxing state, and if that's capped, it's certainly something to look at. And it can be worth thousands of dollars. It's definitely worth spending the time to set it up. Now, what's going to happen with tax laws, the federal tax laws? We have no idea. I've heard some proposals from people in Congress about, keeping the SALT limit at $10,000, doubling it to 20 for married folks, eliminating it completely. I don't think anybody has any idea what's going to happen with the tax laws in Washington right now. So, kind of keep your eye out for the changes for it. And if you haven't been doing this, might have already been too late, I guess, depending on what tax law changes happen this year. But yeah, it's a great deduction, and everybody should be aware of it.
Yeah, this is part of the rebellion against the limitation of the SALT deduction. Initially it was felt by, the blue states that, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration was out to get them and really nailed them with this one. And so they found a workaround basically so people could still deduct their local taxes. But then, the Republicans are like, we don't like paying taxes either, so let's lower our taxes. So those states did it as well. And, but if you own a business, you ought to be paying your state income taxes through the business. That's the bottom line. So that's the PTET deduction. If you're just now hearing about this and this applies to you, you really need to look this up and start doing this. All right, let's do some more questions here. Let's take this one from also off the speak pipe.
Hi, Dr. Dahle. I am currently in my second year as an attending emergency medicine physician practicing in Dallas, Texas, and I have a question regarding a prior 401k of my wife's from a previous employer. She is now only working part-time at a new employer as she is finishing her PhD and therefore does not receive retirement benefit options with her current new employer. I am trying to figure out what is best to roll the prior 401k over to. From what I understand, the options include rolling it over to a IRA or to a Roth IRA. Are these the only two options other than taking the money out with penalty, which we're not interested in doing? Also was curious if it would be a better option to open a spousal IRA or spousal Roth IRA for her and rolling the money over into that, given that she will not be able to contribute that much with her significantly decreased income over the next couple of years. But I was not sure if that would even be allowed, given that she will still have some income outside of the home. I appreciate any thoughts and input, and also sincerely appreciate all the work that you do. It has significantly improved our financial stability over the past few years. Thank you.
All right, Chris, I think we got a lot to clear up with this one, right? You want to take the first swing at this one?
Sure. Yeah. There's a few things I want to cover. So I guess first, the main thrust, I think, is what do you do with the 401k at an old employer? And there's basically three options. So you can either roll it into the plan at the new employer, you can roll it out into an IRA, or you can just leave it where it is. So I'll kind of go through these one by one, and we'll talk about how that applies to this person. So in general, I like rolling it into the new employer's plan if you can. Just because there's an advantage to simplicity. It's one less account to keep track of. You could even potentially forget about the old account. It makes rebalancing easier. I like simplicity wherever it can be had for a low price. And that's what I did in my previous jobs. Is I just rolled it in the new plan when I switched employers. So a couple potential problems here. The biggest one I think is that this person's wife is not eligible to participate in the plan. My guess would be that the employer would not allow them to roll money into the plan if they're not eligible to contribute to it. It might be worth putting in a call to HR. I'm not 100% sure about that. But some employers who you can contribute to, they will not allow incoming rollovers. I think that's probably not the norm, but it's basically up to the plan whether they let you roll it in. So that would be one thing I would check. That's where I would expect this person to get caught up. The other thing is if for whatever reason, if the new plan isn't very good, if it has bad investment choices or really high fees, you would not want to roll old money into that new plan. That's getting less and less common these days, but there are some bad plans out there. So I would just check and make sure that, there's good investment choices and low fees. Typically a low fee would be maybe less than a few tenths of a percent. I don't know where you would draw the line, but that's about what I would say. If you're less than 0.25% of fees, that's probably good enough to roll the money in there. The second option would be to roll it out into an IRA. So investment choices and fees are not a problem for IRAs. Very easy to find IRAs with great investment options and very low fees. The only issue is that if you're going to be doing a backdoor Roth IRA, then having pre-tax money in that IRA is going to interfere with that because it messes up the pro rata calculation. So if this is Roth money, and I didn't say whether it was pre-tax or Roth, but if it's Roth money, rolling it out into a Roth IRA is probably the best choice because there's no downside for that. If it's pre-tax money, it may not be the best. The cutoff, by the way, I looked it up, is $236,000 of modified adjusted gross income. So if the couple's income is above that level, then they're going to be wanting to do the backdoor Roth IRA, and then having pre-tax money in the spouse's pre-tax IRA is not a good idea.
Yeah. Is above that level or could be in the next few years.
That's true. Yes, that's right. And then the third option is to just leave it where it is. And the only downside to this is you just have extra complexity. You have this old account hanging out there. But if the old account is good, if the plan is good, it's got great investments and low fees, there's really no significant downside to just leaving it there. If it were me, I would rather leave money in an old 401k than roll it into a new plan and pay 1 or 2% per year on it, or lose my ability to do backdoor Roth. So those are basically the three choices on there.
Yeah, and I don't think the questioner realizes that's an option, that you can leave it. And I was just on a 401k meeting yesterday for our partnership. I'm on the 401k committee for my physician partnership. And we've got 20% of the people in the plan no longer work for our partnership, right? I think our plan, I don't know if it's an IRS rule or just our plan rule, but we can't force you out if you have more than $7,000 in the plan. We have to let you stay. Now, we can make it a little bit onerous. We can charge you some fees. I think we're actually probably instituting a fee for that 20% of people, just so they're paying their fair share of the plan costs. But they probably can't throw you out of the plan. So that's definitely an option. You can leave it there for a few years until your spouse gets, another job with a 401k and can roll the money in there, or until you're not going to do backdoor Roths anymore, or until you retire and then roll it into an IRA. This is an option, and probably the best one for this couple, I would think.
Yeah. That would be my guess. There's a couple of other things that stuck out that I wanted to address too. So one of which is the person asked about spousal IRA, and I just wanted to make it clear what that was. So a spousal IRA is not a separate type of account. It's not a separate kind of IRA. It's just the person's IRA. It's in this case the wife's IRA, and the spousal part means that she can contribute to her IRA, sort of borrowing her husband's income. So if the husband isn't attending, so let's assume he's got, a six-figure income, she can contribute the full $7,000 to her IRA using his income. And if she earns, let's say she earns $3,000 or $4,000, that really doesn't affect how much she can contribute, because then she could just contribute, let's say, like the $3,000 she earns, and then she would just borrow $4,000 from her spouse, and then that would go into her IRA, the same as if she didn't earn it. So basically, there's no impact of her earning on what she can contribute to an IRA. She can contribute the full $7,000 either way.
Yeah, I think people really need to understand that, right? Because in the 21, 22 years or whatever we've been saving for retirement, Katie did not have an income for something like 8 or 9 of those years. But she has made a full IRA contribution for every one of those 21 years based on my income. And so don't forget to do your spousal IRA contributions. And if your income's high, we're talking about a spousal backdoor Roth IRA in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. And then also, her income and whether or not she has money in an IRA, if it's, rolling it out to a Roth IRA or whatever she ends up doing, that does not impact the ability to contribute to, the spousal contributions to the IRA.
Yeah.
The other thing that was interesting is this person did mention rolling it out into a Roth IRA. Now, I want to be clear that if the money is already Roth, I think rolling it out into a Roth IRA is the right move. If the money's pre-tax, rolling it out into a Roth IRA is an option, but that then becomes a taxable event.
Yeah, so you got to go listen to the first 45 minutes of this podcast and figure out if that's the right move for you or not. And if it's a small 401k, it might be, even if it's like dollar-wise, not the right move, just because it allows you to start doing backdoor Roth IRAs rather than having this pro rata issue.
Yeah, there's advantage in simplicity. If it's, I don't know where you would draw the line. If it's less than $10,000, even if you're paying, not the ideal tax rate on it, to be able to get it out of the old plan, get it into a Roth IRA, it'll be tax free forever. You can pull money out if you need it in an emergency. There's a lot of advantages to it. I think paying an extra $500 in tax, compared to if you really separated out the pre-tax money and kept it separate your whole life, I think there's a point of diminishing returns with that.
For sure.
Now, if it's $250K of pre-tax money, I probably wouldn't do that, because that's extra taxable income. You're gonna have to pay $100,000 in taxes on that, and that's probably not the right move.
Yeah, well said. All right. So when people are really out there trying to get business tax deductions, the ones they really want to talk about are home office deductions and deducting their cars.
Yeah.
But there are so many misconceptions about these two deductions, and so many people, frankly, cheating on their taxes with these two deductions. I think it's worth talking about what the rules actually are, how these deductions actually work, and maybe pointing out where people screw them up. Why don't you talk first about, let's do the home office deduction.
Yeah, so home office deduction, it's a good deduction. I like it. My wife takes a home office deduction, and we try to get the benefit from it because she legitimately qualifies. What I covered in my talk is I think there's really 3 criteria you need to get a home office deduction. I think the first, and I think this might, for certain specialties of doc, this might be one that catches people, is I think you need to be doing a significant amount of legitimate work in your home office for you to be be considering doing this. If you're an emergency doc and all you do is maybe you check on your phone your schedule a couple times a week, and then maybe once a year you put in like a holiday schedule request. I don't know if that really rises to the level of where I would say you would need a dedicated home office for this. Like, would you go rent an?
The IRS phraseology is regular and exclusive use, right?
Yeah.
If you're using it once a year, that's not regular use.
Right. So, again, the idea is that this is meant to be a substitute for like an office that you would rent. So would you go out and rent an office for that? If the answer is obviously not, you probably shouldn't be taking the home office deduction. But, there's, a lot of cases where people would have a legitimate, use, even if you're an emergency doc, let's say you call patients the next day, or if you're doing webinars, or if you're doing admin work, or if you're doing telemedicine, any of those things, that would definitely put you over the line where you would want your own office for that. The second thing is it has to be your principal place of business. So, if you have a dedicated office you can use somewhere else, the IRS doesn't want you also deducting a home office. And then, there's this regular and exclusive condition. So I don't know where you would say regular would start to where you would draw the line for that. But I thought maybe a couple times a month, something like that would be regular.
Well, this is the fun part about the audit lottery, right? I mean, you get to roll the dice and hope you get lucky with the auditor. Clearly, every day is regular use. Every week is probably regular use. Once a month, you got to say this with a straight face to the auditor sitting in front of you, right? That's not as easy as you might think it is. I think the bigger problem is actually the exclusive use.
That's right.
That means you can't use this space for anything else.
Yeah.
Right. If your kids are doing homework in it, that's not a home office.
Right. Yeah. Or any sort of common area, the kitchen table, the couch, the breakfast bar in the kitchen, none of that, those do not qualify as home offices. And then if you only have one desk that the whole family uses, then that would not qualify. But you can deduct part of a room. So for instance, if you have let's say you have a big spare bedroom, you have a desk on one side, your spouse has a desk on the other, you guys both work from there. You can draw an imaginary line down the middle of the room and you can each deduct your half of the room. And that's your exclusive use home office for each of you. So you can do that. That's legitimate.
Yeah. Now, there's two ways to do this. One's the kind of easy way to do it. The other way is the hard way, but might be worth more money. Let's talk about how to decide between what those two ways are and how to decide between them.
Yeah. So, let's do the easy way first. So the easy way is you can just deduct $5 per square foot per year and up to 300 square feet. So you can't deduct a huge room or multiple rooms and call that your office. But, if you have a bedroom, 150 square feet, you can deduct $5 per square foot per year for that. And that's really simple. You don't have to basically show any proof of the expenses for that. You do still have to meet the criteria that we just mentioned a moment ago. But if you do, then there's really no additional accounting involved.
Yeah, it's a $1,500 deduction. Super easy.
Yeah, that's right. If you want to do the actual cost method, you basically have to add up all the costs for the house, and then you prorate them over the square feet for the whole house of the square foot for the office divided by the square foot for the whole house. So those would be things like you can't deduct your mortgage principal payments, but you can deduct your mortgage interest if you have a mortgage. You deduct a percent of your property tax, homeowner's insurance, utilities, maintenance. Even if you have a house cleaner, you got somebody who comes in, once a month, once every 2 weeks, cleans the house. They're cleaning the office, so you can deduct a percent of that. You add all of those costs for the year, do the square foot proration, and then you can deduct that.
You can also, depreciation is also a cost in there, but it has to be recaptured later when you sell the home.
Yep. So depreciation is calculated on the home office deduction form. If you, so there's a little complexity here. If you're a sole proprietor, you have a home office deduction form that you attach to your Schedule C. And there is a calculation at the bottom, which is the deduction for the depreciation. So in our family, my spouse has an S corporation, and it gets a little more complicated to do the depreciation with an S corporation because the S corporation doesn't own part of the house. And this was something that our accountant, back when we had a full-time accountant, we sorted out. There is, if you read the IRS publications, there is an exception where if you keep really good records, you don't have to recapture depreciation.
Okay.
And for our family and with our accountant, we went through and decided that the complexity of trying to deduct that depreciation and then having to recapture it later was not worth it for us. So what we did is said, well, can we just not deduct the depreciation and then not recapture it? And that was the what we decided to do. I'm not 100% sure every accountant in the country is going to tell you that that's okay. The big risk, by the way, is that for depreciation in general, what the IRS says overall is that even if you don't take it to begin with, you still have to recapture it, even if you didn't take it, which is terrible because that's like, you're basically you're recapturing taxes that you never saved in the first place. But there is an exception where it says if you keep really good records, and you can show that you didn't take it, which we keep good records, then you're able to not do that. But some people may want to take the depreciation deduction, and then if you do, then you have to recapture it. So there's a little bit of complexity there, but that's the choice that we made.
Yeah. Every time I look at that, I go, simplified looks better.
Yeah.
even if it's less money. The other thing too is there's this other awesome, real estate related deduction out there that's dramatically better than the home office deduction, which is your business renting your home from you for up to 14 days a year. And you can rent your home to anybody for up to 14 days a year. This is the, the Masters rule or the Augusta rule. They name it after the town where the Masters is. You can rent your house out for 14 days a year and you don't have to pay taxes on the income from that rental. And so what people do is they rent their house to their business 14 days a year and they get a deduction for the business, but they don't get that income on the personal side. And typically that's dramatically larger than the home office deduction. Now it has to be legitimate rental, legitimate use, legitimate price, all of that sort of stuff. But if you can qualify for that, it's way better than a home office deduction.
Yeah. So the Augusta rule is definitely good. I would say we don't do any of that in our family. Part of the reason is that so under current tax law, entertainment expenses are not deductible. So I've talked to my spouse about, well, if we have her group has an event or a party or a holiday party or any sort of gathering, could we have it at our house, have her business rent it, and then basically pay us personally for that, which would not be personal income. But any entertainment expenses are not deductible. So if you're going to do it, it has to be for a business purpose, for business meetings or, for something like that. And we have not come up with a situation where we could, with a straight face, say, her S corporation really needed this, 4-bedroom house to rent for a week or for however long for a business purpose. So we haven't done it that way.
Yeah, you should start having the WCI staff over once a month for a meeting.
I guess that's an option.
Yeah.
My standard for what I'm willing to do tax wise, as far as aggressiveness, is what I would be willing to explain to an auditor with a straight face, why I did it that way. And, all the deductions that I've talked about that I've been willing to take, and some of them, there is some gray area there. And I am comfortable calling the gray areas in my favor when I think I have a specific reason why. But so far, an Augusta rural rental for us has not met that bar, so we haven't done it.
Yeah, but it sounds like you are actually doing the calculation to do the more complex way to calculate the home office deduction.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, we do. And in preparation for my WCI Con talk, I went and calculated what the square foot cost would be. And again, we're in Los Angeles, high cost of living area. It was like $20 a square foot. So it was like 4 times what the standard rate was.
Yeah, you're getting a lot more than the $1,500.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, let's change to the cars, right? Everybody wants to buy a Ferrari and write it off. Explain why doctors cannot buy a Ferrari, drive it to work and home, and write it off.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a few things to get clear here. So first of all, I think one thing I'll say up front is that the IRS looks at a car as a mode of transportation. So what some people try to do is they put advertising on their car. They'll buy a Ferrari, they'll get a magnetic sticker that says, whatever, business LLC, and they'll stick it on the side and say, oh, I'm advertising my business. And then they, deduct $300,000 car or whatever. So that's not allowed. The IRS does not treat a car as anything other than you getting from point A to point B. So
you could deduct the sign you put on the car, though.
You can deduct the sign you put on the car. That is true, but I don't think that's what most people want to get when they do that. So it's the what you can deduct or whatever the deductible expenses for the car are, and then it gets prorated from your business miles, and I'll talk about that in a second. But whatever your business miles are divided by the total mileage for the car, that's what you can deduct. Your gas, your insurance, your registration, your maintenance, your repairs, washing the car, tolls, all of that can get prorated over whatever business miles that you have. So before I talk about deducting the price of a car, let me just talk about those business miles. So um, any sort of commuting, what the IRS considers commuting is any travel from your home to a work site. That is never deductible because basically they say wherever you choose to live, that's a personal choice. If you want to live really close to your work, if you want to live really far away, that's a personal choice. Your commute is not deductible, even if you're an independent contractor. It's only deductible between work sites. So if you go from your home to hospital A, you go from hospital A to hospital B, home at the end of the day, only the mileage between hospital A and hospital B counts as deductible mileage. The rest of it is personal mileage. So that's the context, and that's surprising to many people. There is sort of a workaround.
And there's an actual wrinkle to that as well. Both of those work sites have to be in the same industry.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, they can't be. You can't go from your job as a doc to your job as a podcaster, and that's not legit.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, so there's a lot of nuance to this. I've looked into a lot, and I basically don't deduct miles. I basically don't.
And there's also nuance with what is considered a regular job versus an irregular job. Like if you get a temporary assignment for 6 months and it's in the next town, I think if it's less than a year, they give you a little more leeway as to driving to that work site if it's meant to be sort of temporary. If it's like a temporary work site, so there is a lot of complexity with that. I think for most docs,
you got to look at a different deduction. It's the travel,
that's
work
right.
travel deduction, not your work car deduction, essentially.
But I think for most docs, going between hospitals probably would be one. The big exception is that if you have a legitimate home office, and again, we talked a few minutes ago about what that counts as, but if you have a legitimate home office, that counts as a work site. So the travel between...
Assuming you work there
yes.
that day that you're deducting the mileage, right? That means you go to the home office, you do some work, you drive to the hospital, you do some work, you come back to the home office and you do some work. Then you can deduct those miles. But if you just come home and wrestle with the kids on the living room carpet, that drive home is not deductible.
I actually am not sure about that.
Not that the IRS is going to be able to prove what you did, right?
Yeah, they're not going to. They may not be able to prove it. I have heard both ways. I would be interested. Maybe this is a homework assignment, but maybe I'll go see if I can find a citation for that one way or the other. I'm not 100% sure.
It seems pretty hard to call it a work site, that you're driving to a work site if you don't do any work there. That's why I'd have a hard time to try to argue that one with an auditor with a straight face.
That's fair, yeah. So I think what people really want to deduct is like the cost of a car, right? Which is basically depreciation, and so there are pretty low limits on what you can deduct. And let me also say too, again, I'm not an accountant. The rules for depreciating a vehicle are pretty complicated. There's different amounts you can depreciate per year. There's bonus depreciation. Even in my case, I'm a hobbyist who's been doing this for like a decade. I consulted an accountant on what was an appropriate amount to deduct for a car and how that depreciation gets deducted. So this is an area where I'm not really comfortable doing it myself. But in general, there is a limit. I think as of 2023, it was $20,200. That was the maximum that you could deduct as the depreciation for the first year, and then that decreases years after if it's just a regular car. So the idea of
we should pause for a second and point out, like with the home office deduction, there's an easy way and a hard way to do this.
That is true. Right? Yeah.
I mean, the easy way is the IRS gives you a number per mile of business miles driven. That's your deduction. If you're driving a Ferrari, you might want to do the other method though.
Yeah. So the deduction for mile is in 2025, it's 70 cents a mile. So whatever business miles you deduct, you can ignore all the other costs. You can ignore prorating, your expenses over personal and business miles. You can just deduct 70 cents a mile. That includes a depreciation deduction, which, by the way, has to be recaptured when you sell a car. I think that is maybe not terribly well known. But that amount,
even if you're taking the standard mileage.
Even if you're taking the standard mileage, 33 cents of that 70 cents is a depreciation deduction that must be recaptured. Now, does everybody do that when they sell a car? Probably not. But you're supposed to.
Turns out I've cheated on my taxes in the past. I did not do that when I've sold cars. Of course, I mostly drive cars into the ground, so I haven't cheated much. But I don't think I've ever recaptured that. That's interesting. I didn't realize that was a rule.
I think so. Yeah. So yeah, but if you want to do the actual cost, then you prorate it over business and personal miles, and then there's this kind of complicated depreciation deduction with a fairly low limit of what you can deduct. So the idea of going and getting a $300,000 Ferrari and deducting $300,000 of your taxable income in 1 year, that doesn't fly. That's not allowed. I think it's worth, if we're talking about this, maybe mentioning the Hummer loophole. So let me explain what that is. So the Hummer loophole. A long time ago, back when cars were much lighter, the basically Congress said that they don't want these limits on depreciation to apply to like farm vehicles. Somebody buys a tractor to till the fields in their farm. You want to be able to deduct the whole cost of that tractor in 1 year, and they set a limit of 6,000 pounds. Which above that you still have to deduct only the only the business miles, the business percent of the miles, but there's not this depreciation limit. So if you buy a $100,000 car, you use it 80% for business in the first year, you can deduct $80,000, the full price in that first year, if the vehicle was over 6,000 pounds. Well, of course, what happens over time, cars get heavier, they get more stuff in them, they get more crash protection or whatever. And then now there's a lot of cars like Range Rovers and larger SUVs that you can buy that are just regular, basically passenger vehicles that are above this. So this was called the Hummer loophole because the Hummer was one of the first cars that was above the 6,000 pound limit. So what people would sometimes do is they would buy a car really late in the year, buy it December 15th, keep really good records, make sure they only drove it, for whatever the 80 miles they drove it in the last 2 weeks of the year, keep really good records, or keep an iPhone and videotape the whole drive so it was clear. And then they deduct the full price of the car in that 1 year. And then they would get whatever $100,000 deduction. So that is no longer allowed, as from what I can tell. So there is now a limit for SUVs. You get a higher limit. This for 2023 it was $28,900. So that is a cap of what you can depreciate for a heavy sport utility vehicle that's over 6,000 pounds. And frankly, I think this is good tax policy because this was an area where people were cheating a lot.
That's a loophole for sure.
Yeah. Now the loophole still exists for pickup trucks. There's rules. I think if you can climb from the driver's seat to the passenger compartment, then that rule applies. But if it's a pickup truck, then you're still allowed to do that. So I guess if you wanted to go buy some big expensive quad cab pickup truck and do this loophole, I guess it's still legal. I don't like driving big trucks, so I would not do this, even if there was a tax benefit for it. But there's that loophole. Effectively, I think the way most people use it, which is like, I want to go buy a $150,000 Range Rover and deduct it all in 1 year. You can't do that anymore.
Yeah, very cool. Well said. Well, Chris, it's been great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being a friend of WCI, and thanks for lending your expertise to the rest of us. And you might only be an enthusiast, a hobbyist, but you've clearly done your homework on these subjects, and that effort is appreciated by the rest of the white coat investor community.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Okay, hope you enjoyed that. It's always great to talk with Chris. He loves this stuff, and I just have the utmost respect for people who are actually still teaching me stuff about the tax code, about retirement accounts, and Chris has obviously done that. He knows his stuff. You can check out more from Chris. You can listen to that talk he referred to a few times on business taxes by signing up for Continuing Financial Education 25. That's our online course. It's 20% off through May 9th. It includes Chris's talk, and Chris's talk by itself will probably save you the cost of the course. But it's 20% off through May 9th, whitecoatinvestor.com/courses. If you want to be a speaker at WCICon like Chris, maybe you're too intimidated now after listening to him talk on the podcast. I don't know. But you can sign up for that at WCIevents.com. Thanks for those of you out there leaving us a 5-star review and telling your friends about the podcast. We got a recent one in from Tiff Siegels. Said, should be required listening for all college students. I found this podcast in 2024 and has made me so much more confident in how to manage my finances. The relief from this stress has improved my quality of life immensely. Dr. Dahle and crew were so thorough in their explanations, inspiring confidence in their recommendations. The guests bring wonderful thoughts, experiences, and perspectives. I wish I had this information while I was in veterinary school or even earlier. It would have made a huge difference. Thank you so much to Dr. Dahle and the WCI team for helping so many of us every day. We also got he also mentions the recommended reading list on the website has also been awesome, and the blog complements the material in these episodes so well. 5 stars. Great podcast review. We appreciate that. That does help us to get the word out about the podcast. Now, this episode was brought to you by Laurel Road for Doctors. Laurel Road is committed to serving the unique financial needs of residents and doctors. We want to help you make your money work harder and smarter. Credit card debt is weighing you down and you're struggling with monthly payments. A personal loan designed for residents with special repayment terms during training could help you consolidate your debt. Check if you qualify for a lower rate, plus White Coat readers also get an additional rate discount when they apply through laurelroad.com/WCI. For terms and conditions, please visit www.laurelroad.com/WCI. That's www.laurelroad.com/WCI. Laurel Road is brand KeyBank NA, member FDIC. All right, we come to the end of a lengthy episode. I hope it was worthwhile for you. I doubt any of you have a commute long enough that you could listen to this in one commute. Give us some feedback if you like these long, detailed ones or not. You can shoot us an email anytime, editor@whitecoatinvestor.com, and let us know how we did and how you enjoyed having Chris on the podcast and what you learned or what questions you might have. This show is run by you. We're trying to create content that helps you in your life. So if it's not doing that, we want to know about it. And if we're succeeding, let us know that too, and we'll keep giving you more of the same. Thanks so much for what you do. Keep your head up and shoulders back. We'll see you next time on the White Coat Investor Podcast.
The hosts of the White Coat Investor are not licensed accountants, attorneys, or financial advisors. This podcast is for your entertainment and information only. It should not be considered professional or personalized financial advice. You should consult the appropriate professional for specific advice relating to your situation.